So Humans on Earth, the ballad of our time, tells the story of humanity's destruction of nature, of climate change and the loss of biodiversity. It also deplores human suffering, suffering caused by environmental degradation and by social injustice. However, the story goes, it does not have to be this way. A higher consciousness of the interconnectedness of all things can help us build a better world. So the composition ends joyfully with the lyrics, we are one, the earth is but one country, and mankind its citizens. And the musical structure of the composition you can compare with a quilt consisting of small patterns or small patches, correlating them to like different contrasting musical sections. Once the music completely leaves the tonal system and it describes the unraveling of the natural systems and of human social order. And then towards the end, all the musical themes that you have heard before will come together when the soprano will sing, the welfare of any segment of society is intricately bound up with the welfare of the whole. I hope that you will enjoy listening to the piece and playing it. Thank you very much, and thank you so much for coming.
humanity has destroyed about half of all plants, about half of all plants, and 83% of wild mammals, and 83% of wild mammals. Where all the bees, where all the butterflies, 1,000,000 animal and plant species are threatened with extinction, are threatened with extinction. Earth's life support systems are unraveling. Earth's life support systems are unraveling.
So many people are suffering. So many people are suffering from poverty and hunger and injustice all around. Now climate change makes things much worse, forcing them to leave us. They will lose their country, their culture, their community,
Has lost its orientation, its orientation.
Powerful and inspiring music. Friends, let's give Christine a round of applause here. Virtual or on screen. That was just a masterpiece.
Well, thank you.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Simon Donner. Simon is a climate scientist and professor at the University of British Columbia, focused on helping the world prevent and prepare for climate change. Simon's research spans climate change science, marine science, and policy, and evolves in response to advances in climate change knowledge and to real-world events. Simon was a lead author on the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment, and he served as an appointed member. Well, at this point, I can continue introducing our speaker, but we will wait until everything is clear before Simon actually begins his presentation. So I was saying that Simon was a lead author on the most recent IPCC climate change assessment, and he served as an appointed member and co-chair of Canada's net zero body, which advises the federal government of Canada on achieving net zero emissions. Simon is passionate about communicating climate science to help others make better decisions about the future. So we're very happy to have him with us this evening. We appreciate him taking time from his busy schedule to address us.
Well, first of all, sorry for whatever just happened, but it's great to be here with all of you. And I'm used to giving talks like after somebody is going over either something really wonky policy related or like putting math equations on the board. So coming up, following up on the kind of orchestral music piece was quite nice as a change. Aaron, I don't know if I'll be able to share the slides.
Give me just a sec to make sure you're able to do that.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, if I can't, it's not the end of the world, but it'd be more fun for everybody if I can. So, anyways, and I'm glad to be here, especially because I was supposed to do this with all of you or some of you back in December, and then I had a huge professional change in my government role. I quit it, and I resigned, and as a result, had to completely reschedule the whole month. And the result was I just wasn't able to do this. So it's nice to be here today. And so I'm just gonna talk a little bit with everyone about a little bit about just some basic bits on the state of like what's happening with the climate, with climate change, a couple of sort of just latest summaries of things, talk a little bit about what I learned from being at COP30, the most recent UN climate summit, and then talk a little bit about the state of climate policy in Canada. But on that latter stuff, I really look forward to just sort of hearing everyone's questions. I'm really happy to answer anything that folks have, and I'm not shy about that. To get started, though, I'll just start chatting while Aaron sees if we can share the slides. And again, it's not the end of the world if we can. Again, I've never met almost any of you, so I don't know everyone's backgrounds, but I think one of the most important things to know about like the science of climate change is that it's actually not new science. And I think it gets presented, whether in the media or even often by scientists, we talk about it as like this is something we figured out in the past couple decades. But climate change science is not like its own branch of science. It is really just an outcome of physics and chemistry. And so just to give you an example of that, I'm considered a climate scientist. My PhD was in something called atmosphere and ocean sciences. But most of what we did was basically just physics equations. I'm just going to share slides now. All right, now people can see that. So the reason I point this out is that I think sometimes when folks when people, whether well-meaning or not, sort of question what they're hearing in the news about climate change, or or whether you're deeply skeptical or not, it becomes easier to do because it's seen as like some separate thing that just emerged recently. But the science of climate change just builds on what we learned from fundamental physics and chemistry in the 1800s. And just to give you an example of that, this is a copy of an article by Svante Arrhenius, who was the old Swedish chemist, published in 1896. It's called On the Influence of Carbonic Acid in the Air Upon the Temperature of the Ground. And by carbonic acid, he was referring to carbon dioxide, which is what carbonic acid is, what it becomes if you dissolve carbon dioxide in water. And he, in this article, based on experiments that have been done earlier in the century, showing that CO2 is able to absorb certain types of energy, of radiative energy. Arrhenius calculated how much the Earth would warm if we doubled the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the answer he got, while not the same as the answer we get today, it wasn't like off by orders of magnitude. It was about twice what we get today, with more modern techniques. And that just goes to show you that like this isn't a new concept. All that's really happened is we have more data. We have more data. We have better instruments, and we have we have 150 years of humans adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere so that we can measure the response in terms of temperature. And that's why this is so sort of convincing to scientists. And so over the measured warming really started, we have some records going back to the mid 1700s, but it really started around the mid 1800s and accelerated going into the 1900s, and certainly since 1970. Because of adding greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, to the point that now we are setting temperature records. Again, this is air temperature around the planet, also including temperatures over the ocean or surface ocean temperatures. And that is, we will not set a temperature record every single year going forward just because there's noise in the system. So just there's a natural variability in the climate. But we've gotten to a point where each year is likely, going forward, is likely to be in the top 5 or 10 years going forward. So we set a temperature record in 2024. 2025, the data has just been released by the major groups that do this work. And 2025 is coming in as the second or third warmest year in recorded history. And the predictions are that 2026 will probably be warmer than 25 and break the 2024 record. And so we see this. And I like to show, this is a graph put out by the World Meteorological Organization. It's a UN organization. And all they've done is gather together the data from all the different groups. And then all the data from 2025 isn't in yet, and it just goes up through August. But the reason I show you this is you'll see 6 different attempts to figure out what the global average temperature is. And the reason is because we can't just stick a thermometer into the planet and get one answer. We need to average data collected from around the planet. And so scientists might disagree on how best to do the average. And so we do the thing that scientists do. We replicate, right? That's the key to science, is that you have a hypothesis, you test it, you state your assumptions so that somebody else could go back and say, well, I'm not sure I agree with your finding because I don't like this assumption you made. So I'm going to try it a different way. And what you see when you do this is that there's more than 6, but this is the 6 major groups. And the answer is extremely similar. And what I particularly want to point out is the dark blue one, Berkeley Earth, that's listed at the top. That one actually has the steepest slope, but it's very marginal difference. Like they look very similar, obviously. Berkeley Earth was started by a scientist at the University of California, Berkeley, a physicist who is not a climate scientist and was quite skeptical about this work, and said, I don't trust the data from the weather stations. And so I want money to do more research on this. And he got money from a right-wing foundation in the United States. And who funded him, the Koch brothers foundation funded him to do this work, hoping they would find a different answer. And they found effectively the same answer. And ironically, it's even slightly steeper than the other ones. And so it just goes to show you that part of the reason there's such a great scientific consensus on climate change, the reason scientists agree so much is just because decades of replicating the work, trying all different ways to do this and finding the same answers, basically, right? That's part of it. The other thing to tell you is that so if we do, if we take all of our understanding of physics and chemistry and do calculations with that, put it into, have computers help with the calculations, we have models that do that, and we test those models with and without the human influence on the climate. So if you run the model and you don't add in the increase in greenhouse gases due to human activity, and you don't add in the increase in air pollutants due to human activity, you just allow the climate to vary for natural reasons and because of changes in the output of the sun that have been measured and because of volcanic eruptions, it looks flat. There's no trend over time. But if you add all those things in, you add the greenhouse gases and you add air pollution from and everything, you get results that look like the observations. And so this is from my friend and colleague Zeke Hausfather. So he's just done this. He updates this every year. This is a graph showing you the red line are the temperature observations, surface temperature. It's that Berkeley Earth data, right? That one example of those 6. That's the red line. The fuzzy kind of indigo-ish, purplish area, I'm not good with naming colors, is the range of predictions from all of the models that have been run with the greenhouse gas increase in them. And the black is the average of the models. And the red line is in the middle of the range near the black line. And it's a way of saying that when we try to verify this with our knowledge of physics and chemistry, we find that the warming that we've observed agrees with what we think, what from our understanding of physics and chemistry should happen if you add this amount of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and you add this amount of air pollutants, aerosols to the atmosphere, right? And so that's sort of like the foundational stuff. And I'm just showing you the most recent data, basically. A question that's come up, and many of you have probably seen in the news the past couple of years, is a lot of people are talking about whether climate change is accelerating, like whether it's starting to happen faster. And there is a debate among scientists to whether the trend in temperatures is getting a little bit steeper, right? But the key thing to say is even if it is getting a little steeper, it's still agreeing with what the models are predicting, right? So it's not getting beyond what scientists expect to happen. I think more, and most experts would tell you this, is the reason there's this feeling out there that climate change is accelerating is because it's not necessarily the rate at which the planet's warming that's accelerating, but it's our experience of climate impacts that's accelerating. Because let me put it to you this way, like a lot of the ways in which you and I feel the effects of climate change are things that don't happen linearly, that they're kind of threshold effects, right? So for example, right, we only get a forest fire. Once it's lit, a forest fire only is going to spread and expand to really devastating levels if it's dry enough and warm enough, right? And so that's a little bit of a threshold thing where once you get past a third threshold, things get worse. The same is true with biological organisms. Heat stress on trees, heat stress on crops happens past a threshold. A particular thing I happen to study is what happens in the ocean when the ocean warms. So one of the things that happens is tropical corals undergo something called bleaching. This is a photograph of a bleached coral reef where the corals have turned white. That's why we call it bleaching. It's a threshold effect. It only happens when there's a certain level of heat wave that happens. And so bleaching will happen once you have enough heat stress. And so we can go to a point in the past 30 years ago where bleaching was extremely rare. And then 10 years later, it became common. And it's not that climate change accelerated. It just meant as we were warming, we're bumping above the threshold more often. The weather's hotter more often. And so we're feeling these worse effects more often. So even if the trend of warming isn't accelerating, it'll feel like it is because our experience, the impacts are getting exponentially worse. Another really big area in which science has advanced in the past 20 years is what we call event attribution. So the thing that happened, I finished my PhD in 2002. And when I was a grad student, I was pretty much trained, as everyone is, to be very cautious in answering the question, did climate change cause this event, like this heat wave? What we would say in the technically correct answer is to say, well, science can't tell you whether climate change caused an event. We could only tell you that that type of event will become more common in the future. And it's very similar to thinking about other dynamics in science and in health. So for example, everyone on this call knows that cigarette smoking causes cancer, right? But that doesn't mean I could tell you that if you smoke cigarettes, you're definitely going to get lung cancer, right? Because one of the things is more like weather, and one of the things is more like climate, right? And so scientists for years answered that question, oh, did climate change cause this heat wave, by saying no, because it's just not the type of question we can answer. But then advances in modeling have allowed us to come up with a better way to answer the question, basically, is to say, okay, I can't definitively say 100% climate change caused this event, but I can tell you by using, looking at the observations and using modeling, I can tell you the odds this event happens with and without warming, with and without the effect of human activity. And so this is happening more and more often. I'm showing you a photo of fire in a coastal community in California that wiped out the community during those terrible fires last year, right? And so I did one of these studies. My colleagues and I were I think second or third to do one of these studies. It was about 20 years ago, and it took us a full year to do the analysis. Now, because of better models, better computers, and everything, they can do it in a couple days. And I'm always embarrassed to talk about the research we did back then. Now there are hundreds of studies like this around the world, and that's why after a devastating event, like, for example, the heat dome that killed hundreds of people here in Vancouver a few years ago, scientists can come out a few days later and say that event was 100 times more likely to happen because of the human impact on the climate. It's an advance in research that we just were not able to do that analysis more than 20 years ago, right? So that's a big advance. And so I'm just showing you a map here of all these different examples from around the world. So 100 studies within North America where we found that climate change made a weather event more severe or more likely. And the only reason there aren't more of these is it just takes effort and time to do the research. But this analysis is possible with any event. And the Canadian government now has, Environment Climate Change Canada now has its own system for doing rapid assessment. They were able to assess 12 heat waves last year, and of them, 11 of the 12 were 2 to 10 times more likely because of climate change, and one of them was more than 10 times more likely because of climate change. So just to say that, like, our understanding of connecting individual events has gotten stronger. The other thing that's changed in the past 20 years is the science of what happens if we stop emitting greenhouse gases. So scientists used to think if we actually managed to stop emitting greenhouse gases, stop burning fossil fuels, that there would be this legacy, that it would take time for the climate to respond and the planet would continue to warm for a long period of time. But through advances in modeling analysis, we've gotten to the point where it's very clear that when we stop, if we can get emissions to zero or to net zero, and by net zero, we mean that what's added to the atmosphere is countered by things we do to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, by planting trees or building machines that pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, so that there's no net addition to the atmosphere, the warming actually will stop. And this is a really vital thing because this motivated policy around the world. This advance in science made it into the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement said in the latter half of the century, we want emissions to get to net zero and everything. And then that led to policy action around the world. So this is the statement in the Paris Agreement. In Paris, they said we wanted to avoid 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming. That was a goal that was sort of informed by science, but geopolitically mediated. That is what governments could agree to. If it was clearly a scientific result, it would not be a round number. It would have a lot of decimal places. But in that, it said we want to get to this balance of emissions and removals to be zero. So reach net zero in the latter half of the century, because scientists are telling us that that would stop the planet from warming and stop impacts from getting worse, right? And so because of that, governments around the world and companies around the world passed legislation or put rules in saying, we want that to be our long-term goal. We want to get to net zero emissions. Canada passed this act in the year 2021, and in it, it said we need milestones along the way. This figure is from the legislation, saying that every 5 years we want to have a target, an interim target, and we want to be on this pathway to get to net zero emissions to do our part. We're only one contributor, obviously, to getting to net zero emissions. And so this is a case where science really did inform policy. I think there's a misconception when you hear the term net zero, because a lot of companies started to adopt it, that it sounds kind of like greenwashing and doublespeak. And yeah, that can be true. People make this as a target, but they don't put a plan to get there sometimes. But the truth is, it is actually a scientific finding. Like it's there for a reason. This was science, finding its way up through the sort of policy and political process. So what does it mean to get to zero? I'm going to show you a graph that folks who know me will have seen before. So this is, I'm showing you global emissions of carbon dioxide just expressed in units of carbon. So this is from fossil fuel emissions from around the world. And the change over time, you'll see a little dip in the year 2020. That was the pandemic. People were at home. There was less transportation. There were less flights, et cetera. And so CO2 emissions were lower in that year. And so this data goes through the year 2021. This is that funny little triangle. That is the pledges the world's governments have made for the year 2030. So what emissions will be if we achieve the targets that have been set out and implement the policies that are sort of underway in countries around the world, saying that we're at a point where emissions could plateau soon if we stick to our plans. And the reason I point that out is because that's the trajectory emissions we're on. And so when people say we're not getting anywhere, we've done nothing, it's true. We are very far from the targets we're supposed to achieve, but we have accomplished something. We're on a much worse trajectory 15 years ago than we are today, right? And so there has been some progress. And so just to give you a sense of what's necessary from like a visual numerical standpoint, this is a trajectory that would for sure help the world avoid 4 degrees of warming, right? So something we definitely want to avoid. This is one that would help us avoid 3 degrees of warming. And so the trajectory we're on right now is somewhere, the best guess is if we hit the policy targets that have been agreed to by governments around the world, we're somewhere a little under 3 degrees, right? But of course, what the world has agreed based on advice from scientists is that we'd like to avoid 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming. I'm a skier, longtime skier. I live on the West Coast. And so I like to label these like ski runs. And so I think of these as sort of the easier or intermediate runs, which are use the green circle and black square labels at mountain resorts. And so those are things we can accomplish. They're not easy necessarily. The 3-degree trajectory is not easy, but it's very doable with existing technologies and everything. That's the trajectory we need to take to avoid 2 degrees of warming and the trajectory for 1.5 degrees of warming, right? These take more guts, more courage. This takes more aggressive policy action. And to be brutally honest with you, we are so close already to 1.5 degrees of warming that I'm not sure this run, if you were at a ski area, I think they'd close the run. I think they would say it's too dangerous. That it would be almost logistically impossible for us to avoid 1.5 degrees of warming at this point, unless we were able to surpass 1.5 degrees of warming and then develop ways to pull CO2 out of the air, do that later in the century, and then the planet cools back off below 1.5 degrees later on. It's kind of fantastical, probably is not going to be possible, but that's the one scenario that scientists talk about. So that's kind of where we are. That's kind of the scientific picture. What's going on? I was lucky enough to be one of the representatives of COP30. I was there through the Net Zero Advisory Body, the federal advisory body I was a part of until early December last year. And I think one of the most important things to know about the international climate negotiations is that because the Paris Agreement is in effect and countries are all sort of working towards their own emissions targets, what goes on in the negotiations is not as vital as it used to be. And really what's important you get out of COP30 by attending, we're going to COPs, is seeing where countries are and what they care about and what they're working on. And so to me, the take home from COP30 was not the headlines about failures in negotiations. It was how crowded the Chinese pavilion was. Because what you're seeing right here is a photo of a solar farm in China. And China, the world's biggest emitter that everybody was saying, we're never going to get anywhere if China's not in action. China's emissions may have plateaued. And if they haven't, they will within the next few years, right? There's some evidence that their emissions actually began to drop last year. It's unclear if this is complete enough. But the truth is, even the Chinese government says, yes, we expect our emissions to be going down by the end of the decade. And it's because of this clean energy revolution going on around the world. Now, whether that revolution is going on because of the climate negotiations or not, we can debate. But the truth is it's happening. And so if you went outside the negotiating rooms and went into the pavilions where delegates from different countries were giving presentations on actions that are being taken, what you heard about was the incredible advance in solar, the incredible advance in battery technology, and winds and electric vehicles and everything that is happening around the world. It's being driven largely by China, but it's not just happening in China. And it's just the things that are being manufactured in China are having a huge impact on other countries. So like the country of Nepal, a developing country, in the Himalayas, 70% of the vehicles sold last year were electric vehicles largely from China, right? So this transition is happening and it's spreading around the world. It's just not hitting North America as much, right? And so the message I usually give from a policy perspective is that right now, with everything that's going on under the Trump administration and everything, it looks like there's serious headwinds for climate action in Canada. But now that's short term. The tailwinds are good. And long term, on the long term, there are tailwinds because there's not really stopping this big clean energy revolution around the world. For Canada, and I'm showing a picture of Parliament, for those of you here in Ottawa, the big question right now is what team are we going to be on, right? And so the choice that's being made seems to be we're trying to split the difference, and we're a little bit, doubling down on the past a little bit, right? A little bit with the MOU with Alberta around maybe building a new oil pipeline and some of the weakening of some of the federal climate policies is concerning because of that. And so I'm going to show you, this is just a graph. This is from our colleagues at the Canadian Climate Institute who do great work, where they tried to estimate which of the various climate policies put into place by the previous government, of which we're going to do the most, could do the most if they were implemented and were as effective as possible to get towards our target that Canada has to be to 2030. And I wanted to show this to you because to say that among these things, you see the oil and gas emissions cap, the fuel charge is the consumer carbon price, the clean fuel regulations, and the EV standards. Those are effectively all being canceled. If they haven't been already, they're going to be, or they're under question. And the large emissions trading system is the industrial pricing system, and it's unclear what the outcome of those negotiations are going to be. And so a lot of pieces of this house we've built of climate policies have been removed. A lot of bricks have been taken out of the building, so it's not as strong as it used to be. And so in the late last year, the government had a mandated report that they, under the legislation, had to release on progress towards 2020, towards the 2030 target. And don't worry about all the details on this slide, but the take home was, instead of getting to the 40% reduction, the modeling is telling us that based on what they're doing, it's more like a 20% reduction. And I will tell you that other modeling would say this would be fortunate to get to that target. They had a 28% reduction. That's if everything continues to be implemented as intended. It's unlikely that that will happen. And so we are quite far off base from our internal targets. And this is just from the government's modeling. External modeling is even more critical from a Canadian perspective. But I want to point something out. A lot of the conversation in Canada is about like the specific climate policies and what we're doing about industrial pricing and where we are with our 2030 target. But there's a whole other conversation that we need to be happening, because this is not just about trying to marginally reduce our emissions from our existing activities. This is about, there's a clean energy revolution going on around the world, and how is Canada going to be a part of it, right? And so when I was part of the Net Zero Advisory Body, one of the first things we did in year one was come up with a bunch of values and principles. And I thought this was like the most valuable, the best thing we did, to be honest. And there are two of our principles that I think are really important. One of them was to acknowledge where there's certainty, and the other was to beware of dead ends. And this is what we mean by it. A lot of the solutions to climate change, we kind of know what they are at this point. We know that passenger vehicles are going to be electric. We know that most electricity should come from renewable sources and be backed up by batteries. And we know that home heating in most parts of southern Canada in the cities can be done with heat pumps. And so we already know this. And so we could be pushing towards this now, because in 30 years, this is what the future is going to look like. This is what's happening in other parts of the world, right? And so that's what the idea of acknowledging certainty. But the other one is to be And this is backed up by the fact that the price of all these things has dropped precipitously in the past 15 years. And I'm just showing you some data on the price per unit energy and how quickly it's dropped for different forms of solar power, et cetera. I don't have batteries on here, but batteries technology is about the same, about a 90% drop in the past decade. And the other one was about bewaring of dead ends, that the risk is if we take too long to shift, that we invest in things that you put a lot of capital investment in something, it locks in emissions for many years to come, and then it costs a lot of money. It's really hard on people to transition because it costs them their jobs and everything. And so one of the things that we did, I was trying to articulate as part of the advisory body, and that I worry about a lot, is that, we've had a very successful oil industry for a long time in Canada, and it's done a good thing for a lot of people in the country. But the long-term signs is that the demand for heavy oil is going to drop quickly as EVs spread around the world. It's not all oil, but particularly the heavy, more expensive oil, and that's going to have an impact on Canada, right? And so it's not just about the climate policies; it's about the long-term planning for the future of the country. And so that's the sort of policy bit I can share with all of you. And then just to say, we need the guts to go down those steeper runs effectively. Yeah. And so now I'm happy to take questions. I see one in the chat already. If you're interested in more about what I do, I'm incredibly easy to find online. All university professors are. Just Google my name, but also I've got a website, my name. And then if you're curious about what we do more broadly at UBC, I run this initiative at the university that tries to promote climate solutions research. So that's it from me. And then I just look forward to chatting about your questions.
I see a lot of thanks and gratitude to you, Simon. And we want to thank you for a deeply informative and inspiring presentation. And we appreciate your insights and hope that this discussion motivates us all towards collaborative local action for a sustainable future. And so, friends, to participate in the conversation, please raise your virtual hand or share your question in the chat. I see there are a lot of questions and comments, so Simon, take it away.
Sure. I might just, for everyone, I might just go because I saw Diana wrote that in the chat, I think a few minutes ago, in saying that there was a big fear of runaway climate change in the 1990s. I would say that some of what you're mentioning there, it's not that changed. I think it gets misinterpreted a little bit. So one of the fears is that although the warming, even if warming continues sort of linearly because of adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, we could pass thresholds that trigger feedback effects, right? So one of those thresholds would be if we melt a lot of permafrost in the Arctic, that could allow carbon in the ground to be emitted into the atmosphere as the greenhouse gases, CO2 and methane. That is something that we are still concerned about. But it's not like runaway warming permanently. Like it wouldn't mean that we're going to have accelerated warming that will go on for centuries. And how much of that happens depends on how much the planet warms. Like if we could stop warming at today's level, we're going to cut that off from happening. The other one that you mentioned is the ocean belt. Yeah, so there's it's sometimes called the ocean's conveyor belt. There is still concern that past a certain level of warming, we will trigger the slowdown of a major piece of ocean circulation. It has happened in the geological past. And that would lead some of the northern hemisphere, but particularly northern Europe, to cooling off. And it would be quite dangerous because it could happen quite quickly. The evidence on whether that could even happen this century is still pretty mixed. But because it's the type of science that, is frightening, and we have to take seriously if it does happen, it gets a lot of attention. And I'll be brutally honest, it's not reported well. And so one study that's an outlier from the rest of the research sounds catastrophic. It gets a lot of public attention, and it's very frustrating for other scientists. It's the best thing I can say about that. Yeah. And I think I'll go to Suzanne, whose hand is up, and I can see with her lovely background on my screen.
Okay, thank you. I don't quite know how to formulate this question, but I was quite shocked at the reporting that there was an agreement between the federal and the Alberta government without any consultation with the Native people or the Indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, what kind of role do the Indigenous peoples of Canada have, and what kind of influence? I think that they're a key factor in all this, and I'd appreciate your insights in that area.
Oh, Suzanne, I really appreciate the question. As I think has been alluded to, I ended up resigning from my role chairing this federal advisory body shortly after the MOU was signed. It was not purely because of the MOU, it was because of internal stuff with government. I felt like I'd been put in a politically compromised position. And I'm like, hey, I'm a scientist, I'm not a politician, I'm not gonna like defend what you're doing. Um, uh, but I agree with you. I found that very upsetting. And as to what role they play, I mean, that's a problem that goes so beyond like climate. That's just the nature of the country. And I can just say in my small window into government workings, again, I was technically a government employee, but I was an outside advisor that was supported by government, a bunch of wonderful government staff, along with the rest of our team. What I saw about it is that like they're trying hard at reconciliation, but the depth of the mistrust between the nations and government it's going to take a long time. So even though reconciliation is ongoing, and I mean I see really big sweeping changes like here at UBC, it's really hard to get past as soon as an email comes from, you try to arrange a meeting, the email can't come from one of the government staff. It should come from one of us that are outsiders, because it just immediately everyone's immediately tense if it's a government, if it's an official. So I don't really have an answer for you other than to say that I agree with you. And I'll just say one more thing. I mean, I think I was most disturbed by personally with the MOU by the way it was talked about by some of the ministers, particularly the energy minister, that I think they were just saying, this is just a deal we're making. And I'm like, that's not how you like, that's actually goes against goes against UNDRIP, the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so you can't actually, according to what we've agreed to, we can't do negotiations that way. You have to negotiate, so anyways, I was as disturbed by that as anyone else, just to say. Yeah. Thank you. Darlene.
Thank you, Professor Donner. You refer to short-term headwinds and long-term tailwinds, and I'm wondering how hopeful you are that we will even get some long-term tailwinds. I personally am concerned to see retrenchment both on policy and legislation at the federal and provincial levels in Canada, let alone south of the border in the United States. And you're saying if we choose, but unfortunately our politicians are not choosing anything other than weakening. So where would you get your optimism that we can turn this around?
Yeah, it'd be clear about that. I'm like talking globally. What about the tailwinds and headwinds? So the piece that makes me most nervous is not specific about Canada. It's just like the world, because of the Trump administration, just heading into a more authoritarian place. I mean, so that's just dangerous for reasons independent of all of this, but I think of how that would also impact climate efforts. My optimism about the tailwinds is that we finally got to the point that climate action is the economical thing to do, right? It's the cheaper thing to do, and countries are making this choice that are not the ones that you normally expected, right? Like Pakistan, a developing nation, right, is doing a huge build out of solar because they're able to get cheap solar panels, right? And everybody always talked about, for years, it was like the developed world, the industrialized world needs to lead and the global south will follow. And we're now seeing this happen because of this clean energy revolution that China has largely, but they're not solely responsible for it, but it's largely pushed. And so Canada is stuck in between. Canada's in a weird place. Like the world is dividing in a way between kind of the petrostates and the for lack of a better word, like what a colleague of mine calls the electrostates, the ones going to develop based on clean electricity. And we're a weird place because we're both. It just depends on the province, right? BC is an electrostate, Alberta is a petrostate, right? And it's very difficult in defense of the prime minister. This is very difficult to manage, right? Given the rights that the provinces have. I would say what I'm finding frustrating about the signals from government is my understanding internally is that there is like serious interest in, holding on to that clean energy economy. But they don't talk about it enough and they're not being forceful enough. And so instead, the discussion about oil and gas just drowns everything else out. So I don't know if that helps.
Thank you.
We'll go maybe next to Bill, and then we'll take a question from the chat.
Bill Edgar. There's two Bills here.
Oh, Bill Edgar. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm not a scientist, just a concerned citizen. I did do an AI or a Google Gemini search about will temperatures continue to rise if we reach net zero, and there seemed to be a lot of documentation indicating that temperatures would continue to rise even after we reach net zero, which is, from what I understand, you said is completely wrong. So, can you elaborate on what you see as this thermal equilibrium of the Earth and its systems with relative to the percentage of greenhouse gases we have in it?
Yeah.
I don't understand why there seemed to be a lot of documentation indicating that temperatures would continue to rise for quite a long time, looking at a century or more, and then what you said seems to contradict that. So, can you explain a little? Thank you.
No, for sure. Well, from like a first principle thing, actually, we're just doing this in class earlier today, actually. So when the climate's stable, it doesn't mean that every year is the same. It just means that there's just variability around the kind of an equilibrium, right? When that happens, it basically means that the amount of energy the Earth, the sun, the planet's taking in is equal to what it's putting out to space, right? And right now, as long as we add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and keep doing it, we're creating an imbalance, right? Where we're sort of we're absorbing more energy at the surface than we're giving off. And the way the planet corrects that is by warming up. And then it warms up, it gives off more energy, and it comes back to equilibrium, right? And so that should happen when you stop adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. The debate, I think, and I don't know, I can't speak to the AI search. In the past, models thought there would be a long legacy when you stabilized, when we sort of stabilized, after we were like effective in combating emissions. And I think part of the confusion was the difference between emissions and concentrations. So the emissions are what we're putting into the atmosphere, and the concentrations are what's in the atmosphere. I like to think of it as like a tap into and then like how much water's in the sink or in the bathtub, right? And so we're talking about once you get to the net zero means the amount of water in the bathtub doesn't change, right? The science is very clear that when you get to that, the warming commitment is the average of all the results from all the models is 0. But there's an error to it, as there is in science. So like plus or minus 0.3 degrees. My guess is if AI is giving you a different answer, it's a little bit about the precision of the question and that it's drawing on. I mean, listen, AIs draw on the internet, and the internet's got a lot of stuff. Some of it's wrong, but also some of it's just old. And this is among the reasons, to be honest, my students in my classes are strongly warned not to use AI to search for information about climate change because it'll give you a broadly correct answer, but the precision when it comes down to the type of stuff we do in class won't be good enough. And so I think what you're probably running into is it's broadly correct, but not specifically. Like, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just so. In other words, at net zero, there's thermal equilibrium
Yeah, we should get there.
immediate.
Yeah.
What you're saying is it's immediate.
It's not like the next day, but it's pretty quick, like within years. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for Bill, Edgar. I'm gonna jump just to Jennifer. I think you had a question in the chat. You noticed in one chart map that there was fewer events in the southern hemisphere. Very good. Okay, so I showed you a map of research that was of studies that have attributed weather events to climate change. There are fewer of them in the southern hemisphere because there's less research effort on events in the southern hemisphere, right? That's the large reason. And a little bit because most of the time when we're studying weather events, we study weather events on land. And there's more land in the northern hemisphere. But it's not about where CO2 is emitted. CO2 mixes fairly quickly throughout the atmosphere. And so the CO2 we emit in the northern hemisphere, like it stays in the northern hemisphere for a while, but within a time scale of about a year or so, it mixes into the southern hemisphere. And so when we take CO2 measurements, you won't get the same value everywhere on the planet, but they're all going up at a similar rate, basically, right? And so it's got nothing to do with the effects of climate change. It's more just about where the research effort is.
Right. So it's under reporting then.
Yeah, it's underreporting. And it's honestly, I'll tell you, this is like a long time problem in climate science is, for example, like when we try to do calculate the global average temperature and we use weather station data. Well, what can you do about the fact that the southern hemisphere is mostly ocean and not as many weather stations, right? And so that's complicated. And then when it comes to long-term historical records, there's going to be much fewer in the southern hemisphere. It's a long-standing challenge for scientists. So. Very global stuff. I appreciate the question. That was a good geographic question. I think Angela Keller, I think you have a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I find many things really hard to understand. So I have a question about gas and I have a question about oil.
Sure.
So there's a lot of information, including like billboards here in Ottawa, that tell us that large exports of LNG gas from Canada will help global emissions. And then I was reading recently that whether Canadian LNG exports will reduce global emissions is uncertain. And that came from the Canadian Climate Institute that I thought was like reputable. So I'm kind of like, I don't understand this. My second question
it's a very important question. I'm glad you asked that.
Is like the US foray into Venezuela and the Trump assertion that he's going to unlock the Venezuelan heavy oil seem to have led both the Globe and Mail editorial board as well as the CEO of the Bank of Nova Scotia to say that there's now increased urgency and impetus to build this second pipeline to Tidewater. And I don't understand the logic of that at all.
I love your questions. I'm happy to tackle both of them. The first one is the first one on natural gas or fossil gas is one that like there's a more of a clear like scientific accounting answer to. The second one I'll give you what I think, right? So to the first one, the first thing I'll say on this subject on climate change, never trust a billboard. Because people like me don't have the money to put billboards out. So the billboards you're seeing are usually not from the experts, right? So that's the first thing I could say. The argument for natural gas as a climate solution is that when we use natural gas to produce power or to heat your home, right? The chemistry of it is it emits carbon dioxide. So it is a fossil fuel and it emits carbon dioxide. But it does so, it's a simple chemical equation. It does so at about half the rate of coal. So if you had your electricity system depended on coal burning power and you switched to natural gas, you could cut your emissions. You couldn't get them to zero, but you could cut your emissions. So the United States has been very successful at incrementally cutting its greenhouse gas emissions over the past 20 years because of switching from coal to natural gas. Canada also has done some of that, but we haven't been it hasn't been as impactful on our national emissions because we weren't as reliant on coal as the US was, right? So that is a true thing. So the argument that the industry and some of its supporters make in Canada is that if we produce natural gas in Canada and we sell it to a country that is using coal for power, and they then are you going to use natural gas for power instead, then we are helping reduce emissions globally. So that's the argument that billboard is basing itself on. It is very logical sounding on the surface, but when you dig into it, it doesn't make any sense, right? And the Clean Climate Institute's work on this was very good. It's also being very diplomatic, right? And so it's not as critical of the statement as I think it could be. But the work is great. I know the people that did it, like they're fantastic, right? The reason it doesn't make sense is because it's an accounting issue. If let's think about it this way, right? Like, so if China, for example, imports our natural gas, they decide we're not going to build a coal, instead we're going to shut a coal power plant and we're going to build a natural gas plant, right? They're going to expect that the emissions reductions, that they get to count them. But Canada is saying, well, we'll be selling you the gas, so we get to count it. But that is not how the emissions accounting works anywhere in the world. That's an international agreement on how we do accounting. It doesn't work that way. So the only way we could do it is if we made like a deal with the country where they did something where you compared what emissions would have been in the counterfactual if the plant wasn't built, and if the country agrees that Canada gets the credit, like this whole complicated thing. But no country would ever agree to that. Another way to think about it is that if we were agreeing to that, it's basically saying Canada is taking responsibility or gets credit for what it exports. So if we want to take credit for exporting natural gas and reducing someone else's emissions, we should be also taking credit for exporting oil. And meaning that the oil's burned somewhere else, that's our responsibility. So it doesn't really make any sense. And what's most important is that the way you would make one of these deals, which is through a mechanism under the Paris Agreement, they don't allow it. It's not going to be allowed. And so that argument's going nowhere, but it's just one of these things that's become sticky because it sounds convincing. And the natural gas proponents continually been making it. So that's a natural gas one. On the Venezuela thing, listen, this is complicated. The challenge for Alberta, right, is obviously that they're exporting oil largely to the US, and part of it is they want to sell more oil, but also diversify the markets because what if the US stops wanting to take Canadian oil? The biggest challenge is that we have a heavy form of oil made from bitumen, right? And if the issue is Venezuela's oil is also a heavy form of oil. So if the US is able to import all this oil from Venezuela, they won't need Canada's. And so the argument that Globe and Mail and the Bank of Nova Scotia and everything's making, this is even more reason to build a pipeline so we can get oil to Asia. But this is where I'm saying that the federal government needs to be more honest with Canadians about the projections of oil demand, because the demand for heavy oil is expected to be going down within a decade. And if you think of how long it will take, particularly to build a pipeline through northern BC, like it's not going to be operational by the time be operating just when the demand for heavy oil goes down. And so I don't think it makes logical sense, but I do understand there is an alternative argument. So I don't want to claim I know I'm right. I just don't think it makes logical sense. So I think we probably agree on that. And then with that, I'll go to Bill Kelly. I think if you're up,
Yes.
yeah, okay. And then we can go to the chat.
Yes, thank you very much. I've been in my own mind like defending what's going on around the idea that governance is a difficult thing, and that we have a need for national security, we have a need for a robust economy, and we have a need to deal with the environmental crises. And I'm just wondering from the the perch that you've been sitting on, do you see a sincere interest in looking for areas where all three of these objectives are, what can be done for all of these, as opposed to the compromising one for the sake of the other?
Yeah, Bill, really appreciate that. So I can't tell you what's in the Prime Minister's mind. Like in my job, I did get to talk to a lot of people in government, but we reported through the minister, we advised the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, and so I'd never met anyone in the Prime Minister's office. But my sense of what I've heard and what I'm hearing uh, from government and just my experience from the issue is that like they do take this really seriously. So is it disappointing as that MOU was to I think a lot of people on this call? Um, like Mark Carney cares about climate change. I think that is real, and all the ministers I've spoken to and met, they do as well. But this is hard. Like this is legit hard. What's going on with the Trump administration is like unprecedented from Canadian history, right? And so I think what's going on is that they are trying to do what you're saying. And I think they're just like honestly coming to this quite honestly and just not making, in a couple cases, making the wrong choices. And so some of it is they're being convinced that they can do this grand bargain where they're going to be able to increase oil exports, but decrease emissions from oil at the same time. And I think that they're not hearing the people that are telling them the math isn't working. So that's part of it. But I want to be honest. I've talked to lots of these people. I really think they mean well. Like this isn't nefarious stuff, right? I think these folks mean well. I don't know that that's true for other parties in government on this issue, but I do think they care about climate change. If anything, I would just say that Mark Carney's, the PMO's vision of climate action is very much something that comes from the business and banking world. And it's a bit stuck in the past. And I don't mean just about oil and gas, but I think it's stuck in a time 20 years ago where businesses were really down with this idea of incrementally reducing emissions. But we're in a different place now where it's not just about marginally trying to reduce them, but like people are just completely replacing fossil fuels around the world. And I think they haven't quite adjusted to the fact that that's really the step we need to be making. And I'll just say to everybody, like if Bill, like if what they came out and said was it given all these pressures, we think we want to expand the capacity of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the existing pipeline that comes to Vancouver. I wouldn't like it, but I would have understood that because you could do that in a year or two, and that could mean oil's being exported immediately, like almost immediately, and that is like money coming into the country, right? But to say you want to build one in northern BC that's going to take a decade, and at that point, it's not clear the demand's going to be there. I don't understand the logic of that at all. Like from an economic perspective, certainly not from a scientific perspective. So that's where I'm like, I don't know. I think they're being sold a bill of goods by some folks. Yeah. Anyways, that's it for me. Thanks, Bill. Christine, if you're there.
Yes, thank you. I'm there. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I thought it was very well presented. So wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I have just an observation or an addition to the natural gas topic and the real question that I'm thinking about that I need to ask you. So just another aspect with the natural gas, it's methane, and I think there is a lot of leakage in its production and transportation, and methane is 86% more powerful than CO2. So I think it's not really clear whether, yeah, it might be a little better than coal, but it may not be better than oil. It's still very bad, I think, for the climate. But my real question is, the net zero, that is, I think, please tell me if this is correct, my understanding, that statement that the temperatures will not go up when humans don't emit any more CO2 and or capture what they
Yeah.
are emitting. But that's just humans, because by the time we will reach that equilibrium, net zero, it's very likely that several feedback mechanisms, positive feedback mechanisms, will have set in. We mentioned already permafrost melting, but there are others like oceans and forests no more being carbon sinks, but carbon contributors, and other feedback mechanisms with albedo, etc. So is that really included in these scientific predictions or not?
I would say the answer is sort of yes and no. So I think the thing is the types of feedbacks you're talking about, they're happening at higher levels of warming. And so maybe the best way to think about it is that we need to get to net zero to stop the planet from warming, but we don't want to get to net zero when we've reached 4 degrees of warming, because then those sorts of things really become worrisome. One thing I do want to point out is that getting to net zero, meaning like we stop seeing warming in the atmosphere, doesn't mean that the impacts globally necessarily end. So, for example, there are some lag effects within the physical climate system that aren't just about temperature. So, sea level rise is a long-term legacy thing. So, the choices we're making now, because it takes so long for ice sheets to sort of come into equilibrium with the level of temperature in the atmosphere, that they'll continue to respond for a long period of time after net zero. And so that's one of the things that, like, I study the sea level rise a little bit. That for me would be almost a bigger concern than the CO2 feedbacks, in a way. And so I think I don't want to diminish the importance of those CO2 feedbacks, but I also kind of want to say, like, I think because they sound so scary, they sometimes get too much attention, if that makes sense. Yeah. And I'll just say one quick thing on the methane point. It is very confusing that natural gas is methane, but when we consume it like when we use it in our furnaces or in a power plant, it emits CO2, right? So that's very confusing. But during the transportation of it, if you leak it, it goes out as methane. Methane is a more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. And so it is true that, like, reducing methane emissions is a way to have an immediate impact on the climate. But the flip side of it is that methane emissions only stay in the atmosphere for about a decade. Whereas CO2 we emit, it doesn't have one fixed lifetime in the atmosphere. It's kind of more of like a distribution. But like 20% of the CO2 emit will still be in the atmosphere 10,000 years from now. So it's got a much longer legacy. And that's why, though people get excited about targeting methane, the real one to, like, long-term future of the climate is you got to deal with CO2. Yeah, because that lifetime matters. Yeah. So I will go. I think Sarah, you had a question as well. Thanks for the question, Christine. Yeah.
Yes, I have a paper here in front of me that was written by or published by the BIC, I think, of Christine Mullers on the impact of the article was entitled "Climate Justice: Who Suffers When We Alter the Climate?"
Yeah.
And, I think this type of article needs to be widely talked about, published, and thank you for mentioning. I know you're a scientist, and thank you very much for your research, because I think people need to know. And the fact that you were an advisor for the government, that's really that's wonderful. That's really important, because I know in the past years, some of the leaders were against, scientists putting out information. They were shut out. And so I see two things that seem to be like the Paris deal. I don't know much about it, but it seems to me from what you said that there is sort of like the way that it's presented. It doesn't seem to appeal to some of the people who signed it. They're like, well, we can't do this. It's almost like it's so constricting in a way, and at the same time it has to be. So I don't know how else to explain it. It's as if you cannot exchange one thing for another, and that's the way it's built, because that's the way it will work. Otherwise it won't work. But it just seems like the hamster in the cage, you know, it doesn't seem to be working that well. And I think that because I worked for a law firm and I was
Yeah.
hearing about all these policy behind the doors and everything, not all of them, but I know a little bit more now. And I think that the banking world is really like maybe putting a big wrench in the whole thing, you know, because I think of my portfolio with my RRSPs, and it's like there's a lot of gas and oil. So maybe that if the government of Canada would make a decision to do something about the tar sands and sort of slowly dwindle away from it, it would cause a big crash. It would cause a big crash in the world. So it's really greed that's leading people. It's not, you know, they might say on one hand, yes, you know, we care and we want to do something and we're signing this agreement, but people are not really being truthful. Like the leaders are not taking this seriously, you know. So yeah, it's very hard. I'm thinking of all the scientists at the time of David Suzuki, you know, a lot of them were just like so overwhelmed and depressed because they could see all the data and they could see the trend and they could
Yeah.
see the willpower was not there. And so I became a grandmother last year, so I care a little bit more about, you know, the long-term future of the planet. But it's like, what can we do, you know, as citizens, and especially in Canada? Because this whole thing of you know putting more money and subsidies in those you know yeah these big industries that will completely how do you say that completely prevent anything from happening, you know, because we're all together in this one planet, as you said, you know, the emissions in the north
Yeah.
hemisphere will go down in the south hemisphere, and so
Yeah.
that we're all in this together. So it's like almost one country saying, no, well, I want, you know, I want my share of the pie. And another country saying, well, no, you know, and I think my other question, because now it's just my opinion that's blabbing away, but you shown that slide of all these solar panels in China. Like, are they slowly going away from the use of coal? Like, what's happening there? We don't hear much about that.
First of all, like I appreciate everything you're saying. On coal, I mean, there are countries obviously that are still very reliant on coal, but I cannot. There's two revolutions that have gone on in energy. One was, to be honest, fracking, which made a lot of more natural gas available, and so natural gas is really cheap, and so people were replacing coal with natural gas. That was big in the U.S. And then this clean energy revolution, like the solar, how much cheaper solar and wind power backed up by batteries is cheaper than coal in most parts of the world. When I was a graduate student, I was told that that was like like functionally impossible, could never happen, and that's why we would struggle to combat climate change. So like there's been massive technological advances. So I think there's good news there, and so I think somebody in the chat asked about areas of good news. Listen, the place where Canada's made great strides, we had a big natural advantage, was electricity. Our electricity grid is among the lower carbon ones in the world. In BC, it's pretty much zero carbon. And we've made a big change. Emissions have gone down like 56% on electricity since 2005. But what I'm disappointed by is that like this could be the cornerstone of the Canadian economy, is we could easily be generating be like a world leader in clean electricity and batteries, which we could then use to do all sorts of industry things. Because if there was cheap electricity, people would want to build stuff in Canada, right? So, and that's something where I think we've just been quite short-sighted, and there's a little bit about politics because electricity grids are run at the provincial level, and it's hard to do national coordination, so that's complicated. And I'll just say more broadly to the international point. The Paris Agreement is not perfect by any means, but it's the only thing that probably could work, which is that you can't have the UN telling countries what to do, but you could develop a framework where they all agree to come up with their own targets and try to shame each other into greater targets. And to be honest, like the Paris Agreement's approach was literally called behind the scenes name and shame. So you just have a framework, everyone has to have a target, and then they try to push each other up to ratchet up those targets over time. And a lot of people would say it's not working, but this clean energy revolution has happened, and I don't think it's a fluke. I think it is a common, it's played a role. It's not the only reason, but it's played a role in making that happen. So not perfect, but we are making some progress. And the science tells us like the more we reduce emissions, the less the planet warms. And so although we're not succeeding at avoiding 1.5 degrees of warming, we are having an impact. Like it is better than it could have been. And that's not nothing, right? So yeah.
Super saying that.
Yeah. So anyways, thanks and nice to hear from somebody right across the water in Gibson's. I think maybe last question from Stephen. Sorry if I missed anybody.
Yes, my question now is matching up with the direction of your last comment. I'm all for the quick movement towards cleaner energy systems, but I still have questions about, is our electrical grid stable enough to handle rapid change?
Yeah.
I know Ontario's trying to boost it up. I know in Quebec's always had problems with blackouts and things like that. So I don't know. Is it going to be stable enough? And are all the infrastructures that need to be put in place going to be put in place fast enough? To deal with electric cars and things like that.
Yeah. Fantastic question, Stephen. And I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on electricity grids, but I'll relay what my colleagues say. So I worked with a couple people when I was on the advisory body who had run electricity grids, and they would both say, boy, this is going to be hard. We can never build it out fast. And there's going to be stability issues. The flip side argument that's usually made is that if there's a huge increase in electric vehicles and in heat pumps, which depend on electric heat pumps, so if the demand is clearly going up, the operators are going to want to generate more electricity. The demand will lead to more supply. And part of the reticence around the supply is people don't want to build huge infrastructure if they don't know that they're going to need it, right? And so it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg issue. And so that's one of the things I've heard. The stability issue, I think this is where tech comes into play, and this is where Canada, and I do think this is something the Carney government takes seriously, right? Is investments in AI, in IT and computing stuff. Part of the advantage of that is making the grids within the provinces and the interconnections more high tech. Because if a more technologically advanced grid, you get to now use all those vehicles as part of the electricity storage. Right? So when your vehicle's plugged into the network, so you can organize your own house this way, but to do it on a larger scale is more complicated. But the point being that having a whole bunch of things on the grid that can function as batteries helps with the intermittency of solar and wind power, and helps with the days that there's rolling blackouts because of bad weather or whatever. And so my sense is that if the demand goes up, we'll figure out the supply side. But I think people that run the electricity systems don't say that because they've never been in a world where the demand went up that fast. Right? If that makes sense? Yeah, so cool. Listen, everyone, I think I got all your questions.
Thank you, Simon. We
Yeah.
really appreciate it. And before we close, I'd like to do a little commercial announcement for our next upcoming cafe. Next Tuesday, Tuesday, January 27th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, we'll welcome Karen Mursig from Environmental Defense Canada to speak about plastic pollution. Karen's presentation, Entangled in Plastic, How to Break Up with One of Our Most Pervasive Pollutants, will share the latest scientific updates, information about how plastics are affecting us, and what we can do about it. So please join us for that presentation. And now to close, we'd like to thank Simon and Christine for their wonderful contributions this evening. Our thanks to Carol Gravel and Bill Kelly for preparing tonight's devotional, to Aaron Kelly for hosting, and a big shout out for his handling of the disruption we experienced this evening, and to the Ottawa Environment Forum team for their ongoing efforts. As a token of our appreciation, we would like to share with all of you a link to One Planet, One Habitation, which is an inspiring Baha'i International community statement exploring how humanity can flourish through unity and care for our shared planet. And you should be able to find that link in the chat. And again, we wish everyone a good evening. Take care, and we look forward to seeing you again on January 27th.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.
Welcome.
Nice to
Thank
meet
you
you.
and goodbye.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody, thank you very much.
Merci aux techniciens et à la présentatrice.
Mhm.